The sound of the slap echoed louder than the crystal glasses. For a split second, no one breathed. The chandelier above us shimmered, light scattering across polished marble and imported Italian tile. But all I could hear was the sharp crack against my cheek. My head turned with the force of it. The taste of copper bloomed at the edge of my mouth. 100 eyes lifted from plates of seared filet and truffle risotto and landed on me. Lauren stood there. 27. Soft cardigan. Schoolteacher smile gone feral. "Maybe now you'll learn your place," she said, her voice trembling with something that wasn't innocence. I looked at Joseph. He didn't move. He didn't step between us. He didn't touch my arm. He didn't even look surprised. He just exhaled, annoyed, and muttered, "Megan, don't make this worse." The entire private dining room at Ashford and Vale, executives in tailored suits, investors from out of state. His direct supervisor, Logan, seated 3 chairs down, watched as if I were the disruption, as if I had somehow earned it. But what none of them knew, not Lauren, not Joseph, not even Logan in that moment, was that I had already spent 6 months collecting the kind of truth that didn't bruise skin. It destroyed reputations. And I was the only person in that room who understood exactly how fragile Joseph's world really was. I didn't cry. That was the first thing people noticed. I straightened slowly, pressing my tongue against the inside of my cheek to steady myself. The sting was hot, but it wasn't new. Humiliation has a way of rehearsing itself long before it ever becomes public. "I asked you to respect a boundary," I said evenly. Lauren laughed. "Boundary? You don't even belong here." Her hand slid back onto Joseph's arm, as if it had always been there. Like I was the intruder. Like our 7-year marriage was a clerical error. Joseph shifted uncomfortably but still didn't remove her hand. "We're celebrating?" he said quietly to me. "This isn't the time." Celebrating. He had just secured what he called the biggest contract of his career, a multi-phase redevelopment project on the south side of Chicago. Public funding. Private investors. Political attention. His promotion to senior project manager had come with more than a raise. It came with visibility. And visibility, I knew better than most, could be dangerous. Logan cleared his throat from across the table. "Is everything under control?" he asked, his voice calm. Authoritative. Joseph forced a laugh. "Just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding." Lauren folded her arms. "Maybe she's just sensitive. Journalists usually are." There it was again. The dismissal. The way they said journalist like it meant gossip columnist. Like I spent my days inventing drama instead of dissecting it. For 2 years, I had listened to Joseph diminish what I did. Investigative reporting doesn't build anything, he used to say. It just tears things down. What he never understood was that sometimes things deserve to be torn down. I felt every gaze in that room measuring me, my black dress, my flat shoes, my lack of diamonds. Lauren had dressed for spectacle. I had dressed for observation. And I had been observing for a long time. The phone Joseph always placed face down when I walked in. The sudden offshore consulting partners added to project budgets. The discrepancies between public filings and internal memos. The bonus structure tied to cost overruns, not savings. He thought I didn't notice. He thought loving him meant not looking too closely. Logan's eyes lingered on me for a fraction of a second longer than the others. Something unreadable flickered there. Recognition. Suspicion. He knew my byline. We had crossed paths before at a municipal corruption hearing. But Joseph didn't know that. He never asked enough questions about my work to realize I had been investigating redevelopment contracts across the city for the better part of a year, including his... I reached for my water glass and took a slow sip. "I won't make a scene," I said softly. Lauren smirked. Joseph relaxed. The executives resumed their cautious chewing. The moment, to them, had passed. But humiliation is a hinge. Something shifts quietly. Permanently. As Joseph launched back into his presentation about projected revenue growth and strategic partnerships, I studied him the way I would any subject, posture, word choice, micro-expressions. He avoided specifics when referencing subcontractors. He exaggerated timelines. He leaned heavily on Logan's endorsement without actually citing numbers. 6 months ago, I might have dismissed it as corporate language. Tonight, I heard something else. Deflection. I pressed my fingertips lightly against my cheek. The sting had dulled, replaced by clarity. He had chosen his side in that moment, not when Lauren slapped me, but when he told me not to make it worse. When protecting his image mattered more than protecting his wife. I let him finish his toast. To new beginnings, Joseph said, lifting his glass. Crystal chimed across the table. I raised mine too, because they still believed this was the beginning of his ascent. They didn't realize they were clinking glasses at the edge of a collapse. And as I watched the confidence in his smile, I understood something with absolute certainty. He wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of losing everything else. He just didn't know yet that I was the one holding the thread. I met Joseph when we were both still hungry for something bigger than ourselves. He was 28, ambitious, already speaking about urban renewal projects like they were moral missions instead of contracts. I was 26, fresh off my first byline in a national outlet, convinced that truth could still shift systems if you pulled hard enough. Back then, he admired that about me. You see angles other people miss? He used to say, leaning back in his chair at the small Thai place where we had our second date. That's powerful. He liked telling people I was a journalist. He liked the word investigative. It sounded sharp, strategic. It made him look like a man who valued intelligence. Somewhere along the way, that admiration curdled. The first time he dismissed my work. It was subtle. We were at dinner with one of his early mentors. The man asked what I covered. City politics and redevelopment oversight. I said. Joseph smiled too quickly. She digs into scandals, he added. Keeps everyone on their toes. It sounded playful. I let it pass. But later, in the car, he said, you don't always have to phrase it like you're accusing someone of something. I wasn't accusing anyone. I replied. He shrugged. Just, it's different worlds. Construction builds. Journalism criticizes. That was the first line he drew between us. Over time, the line thickened. When I received a regional press award for uncovering misuse of municipal education funds, he congratulated me. But the edge was there. Must feel good to tear something down, he said, half smiling. I remember staring at him, trying to find the version of Joseph who once said accountability mattered. I didn't tear it down. I said, I exposed it. He kissed my forehead like I was overthinking. That pattern repeated. He moved up quickly in his firm. Assistant project manager to lead. Lead to senior project manager. Each promotion came with longer hours and quieter conversations at home. At first, I believed the distance was stress. Then came the phone. He had never been protective of it before. Suddenly it was always face down on the kitchen counter. Notification silenced. Screen angled away from me in bed. The first time I asked, he laughed. What? You think I'm hiding something? I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have a response, but because I wasn't ready for the truth. Lauren entered the story gently. Too gently. She's new, Joseph said one night while loosening his tie. Helps coordinate community outreach with one of the schools near the redevelopment site. She's a teacher? I asked. Elementary. Smart. Organized? Actually understands how to talk to people without interrogating them. The jab was light. But it landed. I saw her for the first time at a company charity gala. She was younger than I expected. Soft-spoken, beige dress, hair pulled back in a low bun. The kind of woman who knew how to appear harmless. She smiled at me. I've heard so much about you. I held her gaze a second longer than polite. Have you? Joseph's hand found the small of her back when he guided her through the crowd. Not intimate enough to accuse. Familiar enough to notice. That night, when we got home, I asked directly, are you involved with her? He didn't even hesitate. No, Megan, you're letting your job make you paranoid. He framed it as my flaw, as if pattern recognition was pathology. For a while, I chose to believe him, not because the evidence disappeared, but because I didn't want to dismantle my own life. Marriage isn't one moment. It's 1,000 small decisions to stay. I stayed when he skipped our anniversary dinner because a client dinner ran late. I stayed when I found a receipt for a hotel bar on a weekend he claimed he was at a site inspection. I stayed when he said, "You're overthinking this," with a softness that almost felt kind. But I didn't stop observing. Observation is instinct. I began noticing more than Lauren. Budget summaries left open on his laptop. Language in his emails that echoed phrasing I had seen before in other corruption investigations. Vague line items. Consulting adjustments. Phased cost escalations that conveniently triggered bonus thresholds. When I asked about the project margins once, casually, he stiffened. "You wouldn't understand the financial structure," he said. "It's complicated. Complicated." I had built an entire career untangling complicated. That was when something shifted inside me. Not jealousy. Not rage. Curiosity. I started pulling public filings connected to his company. City redevelopment bids are transparent, on paper. I compared projected costs to revised figures. I tracked subcontractors registered within the last 12 months. Some had no visible work history before landing multi-million-dollar agreements. I didn't tell him. I told myself I was just looking. Just satisfying professional instinct. But instinct doesn't operate in isolation. It responds to discomfort. The more I looked, the more patterns surfaced. And the more Joseph dismissed me at home, the clearer it became that whatever was happening in his professional world was bleeding into our marriage. Lauren's presence grew bolder. She began attending more events, standing closer, laughing louder at his jokes, speaking about his projects like she had a stake in them. One night, after too much wine, she leaned toward me at a networking mixer and said, "It must be hard, watching someone build something real when your work is mostly words." Joseph didn't correct her. He smiled. That was the first time I felt the fracture fully. Not because of the insult, but because of his silence. Silence can be complicity. And complicity, I had learned in every investigation I'd ever worked on, was rarely accidental. By the time he insisted I attend the celebration dinner at Ashford and Vale, I already knew two things with absolute clarity. He was no longer protecting our marriage. And he was protecting something else far more aggressively than he ever protected me. I just hadn't yet decided which truth would hurt more to uncover. The first irregularity wasn't dramatic. It was a decimal. I was sitting at my desk in the newsroom, fluorescent lights humming above me, when I noticed the projected cost of one of Joseph's redevelopment phases had increased by 8.7% between two filings submitted less than 3 weeks apart. The justification listed was material fluctuation and contractor adjustment. Normal on the surface. Except the subcontractor named in the revision had been incorporated only 4 months earlier. I opened a new tab and began pulling corporate registration data. No prior projects. No public footprint. A mailing address that traced back to a shared office suite used by 6 shell companies. I felt the same quiet tightening in my chest that I felt whenever a pattern began to reveal itself. This wasn't about Joseph yet. It was about structure. Over the next week, I built a private spreadsheet separate from my official reporting notes. Project names. Original bids. Revised figures. Subcontractor histories. Bonus thresholds tied to completion phases. I cross-referenced everything with City Council meeting minutes and procurement disclosures. 3 additional contracts showed similar patterns. Inflated cost adjustments. Newly formed subcontractors. Performance bonuses triggered precisely after budget escalations. If I had encountered this in any other company, I would have flagged it immediately. The difference was personal proximity. I waited before confronting him, not because I doubted the numbers, but because I wanted to understand the system before I understood his role in it. One evening, while Joseph showered, I walked past his home office and noticed his laptop still open on the desk. An internal dashboard glowed on the screen. Financial tracking interface. Progress bars. Margin indicators. I stepped closer. Phase 3 of the South Side redevelopment showed a projected overrun that would activate a significant executive performance payout. I heard the water shut off upstairs and moved away from the desk. That night at dinner, I asked casually, "How do performance bonuses work on municipal contracts?" He paused for half a second too long. "They're tied to efficiency," he said. "Why?" "Just curious. You've been reading too many conspiracy pieces." He smiled like he was teasing, but his fork scraped harder against the plate. The next morning, I requested public access to additional procurement amendments through official channels. Completely legitimate. Completely professional. If Joseph noticed the timing, he didn't mention it. Lauren's presence continued to intensify. She began appearing in background photos of project walkthroughs posted on company social media accounts. Her captioned role was community liaison, though her credentials didn't match typical liaison experience. I searched her nonprofit filings. The foundation she claimed to volunteer for had received a sizable community education grant from Joseph's firm 6 months earlier. The amount aligned almost exactly with one of the subcontractor adjustments. My pulse slowed instead of quickened. Calm as clarity. I wasn't chasing jealousy anymore. I was mapping connections. 2 days later, an anonymous tip hit my professional inbox. No greeting. No signature. Just a scanned internal memo referencing phase adjustment strategy and instructions to delay certain cost disclosures until after quarterly review. The memo included Joseph's initials under approval. I stared at the screen for a long time. It could have been fabricated. It could have been sent maliciously. Or it could have been someone inside the company deciding they didn't want to go down alone. I encrypted the file and stored it offline. That night, Joseph came home later than usual. His tie loosened. His eyes tired but alert in a way that suggested adrenaline. "How was your day?" he asked. "Productive." He poured himself a drink before asking anything about my assignments. I studied him. There was a new defensiveness under his confidence, like someone walking carefully across thin ice but pretending it was solid ground. "Are you nervous about the audit review?" I asked gently. He froze. "What audit?" The City Council Oversight Committee announced they're reviewing redevelopment cost escalations across multiple projects. He forced a laugh. "That's routine." "Are you sure?" He stepped closer to me then, lowering his voice. "Megan, not everything is a scandal waiting to happen." I met his gaze evenly. "Sometimes it is." For the first time, irritation flared openly in his eyes. "You don't trust me." It wasn't a question. "I trust facts," I replied. He shook his head and walked away. The following week, I attended a municipal transparency forum as part of another assignment. Logan was there, representing the firm publicly. After the panel, he approached me. "Megan Carter," he said, offering a handshake. "Didn't expect to see you covering redevelopment oversight." "I cover systems," I replied. He smiled in a way that suggested he understood more than he let on. "Systems are complex. So are patterns." His eyes flickered briefly. "Calculating. If you ever need clarification on our projects," he said, "my office is open." It wasn't an invitation. It was a warning disguised as courtesy. When I got home that night, Joseph was already asleep. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The evidence was no longer emotional. It was structural. And structure doesn't lie for love. By the time he told me about the celebration dinner at Ashford and Vale, about the new partnership and the promotion tied to it, I already knew something larger was in motion. The public humiliation at that restaurant hadn't created my resolve. It had only confirmed it. Because before Lauren's hand ever struck my face, I had already begun pulling at the thread that held Joseph's professional world together. And threads, once loosened, rarely reweave themselves. The night after the slap, I did not cry. I sat at the kitchen table long after Joseph went to bed. My laptop open, the city lights reflecting faintly against the darkened window. My cheeks still felt warm, but the physical sting had already dulled into something sharper and more useful. Humiliation is loud in the moment, Evidence is quiet. I replayed the evening at Ashford and Vale in my mind. Lauren's smirk. Joseph's silence. Logan's measured expression. The executive's discomfort. The way the room recalibrated itself around Joseph's embarrassment rather than mine. But the moment that stayed with me wasn't the slap. It was Logan's voice. "Joseph, what is this?" There had been no surprise in it. Only scrutiny. I opened the encrypted folder I had been building for months. Internal memos. Budget amendments. Subcontractor registrations. Bonus projections. The anonymous phase adjustment strategy document. And a new detail from the restaurant. The name of the out-of-state investment group Joseph had been courting. I searched their portfolio. 2 prior partnerships. Both under federal review within 18 months of contract execution. That wasn't coincidence. At midnight, I drafted a message. Not to my editor. To an independent financial compliance attorney I had worked with during a previous public corruption investigation. Subject line: off-record consultation. I kept it concise. I attached nothing. Just outlined the structural irregularities and asked for a discreet meeting. Then I closed my laptop and went to bed beside a man who had watched another woman strike me and told me not to make it worse. In the morning, Joseph behaved as if nothing had happened. He kissed my cheek lightly, the unbruised one, and said, "Let's not dwell on last night." I studied his face. No apology. No acknowledgement. Only damage control. "You're right," I said. He looked relieved. He mistook restraint for forgiveness. At work, I compartmentalized. I finished an unrelated investigative piece on municipal zoning variances before noon. I declined 2 interview requests and rescheduled a panel appearance. My phone buzzed mid-afternoon. Unknown number. "Ms. Carter?" the voice asked. Calm. Professional. "Yes." "This is Daniel Harlow. You reached out regarding redevelopment cost discrepancies." He didn't waste time on pleasantries. We met that evening in his office overlooking LaSalle Street. Daniel listened without interruption as I outlined the financial patterns. I spoke clinically, removed from emotion. I did not mention the slap. I did not mention Lauren. "This is preliminary," he said when I finished. "But if what you're describing holds under documentation review, it suggests coordinated cost manipulation." "Is it criminal?" I asked. "It depends on intent," he replied. "But federal redevelopment funds carry oversight triggers, especially if wire transfers cross state lines. Wire transfers. Offshore consulting fees. Subcontractors incorporated weeks before contract approval." I slid the anonymous memo across the desk. Daniel read it carefully. "This," he said quietly, "changes the context." "Because of the initials?" I asked. "Because of the language." He leaned back. "If you pursue this, you cannot be both wife and journalist." "I understand." "And if you're wrong," he added, "the fallout could be significant." "I understand that too." What I didn't say was that the fallout had already begun the moment Joseph chose silence over me. When I returned home, Joseph was pacing. "Logan called me," he said immediately. "About. He heard you were at the Transparency Forum, and that you asked pointed questions." "I ask pointed questions for a living. This is different." "How?" He ran a hand through his hair. "You're too close to this." There it was. Not concern for my humiliation. Concern for exposure. "I've done nothing inappropriate," I said evenly. He stepped closer. "Megan, if you're digging into my company..." "I dig into systems," I interrupted softly. "If your company is clean, there's nothing to fear." The words hung between us like a test neither of us wanted to name. He exhaled sharply. "This is my career. And it's my integrity." We stood there, inches apart, the fracture widening invisibly. Later that night, he fell asleep quickly. I pulled up the redevelopment timeline again and cross-checked it against internal city review cycles. Cost escalations occurred just before quarterly compliance checkpoints. Bonus payouts aligned precisely with revised margin thresholds. Someone understood the oversight system well enough to maneuver around it. And someone signed off. My email pinged at 2 in the morning. From Daniel. Subject line: "We should escalate carefully." The body contained one sentence: "If you choose to move forward, I recommend protected disclosure channels before publication." Protected disclosure. That meant regulators. That meant no turning back. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I opened a new document and began outlining a structured submission. Financial anomalies. Supporting documents. Relevant statutes. Potential impact on public funds. Not emotional. Not retaliatory. Procedural. By dawn, the sky over Chicago had shifted from indigo to gray. Joseph stirred beside me, unaware that the axis of his professional life had already begun to tilt. He believed the worst thing that had happened that week was a public argument at a restaurant. He didn't yet understand that humiliation had sharpened my focus. And focus, when paired with evidence, is more dangerous than anger ever could be. I did not confront him again. Confrontation was emotional currency, and I had stopped spending it. Instead, I shifted into the quietest version of myself. Joseph mistook that for retreat. He became almost gentle in the days following the restaurant incident, as if politeness could erase what had happened. He brought home takeout from my favorite sushi place. He asked if I needed anything. He avoided mentioning Lauren. The avoidance was strategic. So was mine. I transferred my research files onto an encrypted external drive and removed them from my home office. I disabled automatic cloud sync. I began logging every public statement Joseph made about his projects, comparing them to internal language from the anonymous memo. The discrepancies widened. A revised contract amendment appeared in a public filing late on a Thursday afternoon, timing designed to avoid peak scrutiny. The adjustment cited unexpected environmental remediation costs. I requested the environmental impact report. It had not changed. The next morning, I forwarded Daniel the updated documentation. His response came within hours. This pattern suggests intentional cost inflation. We need to consider formal reporting channels. I sat with that sentence longer than I expected. Formal reporting meant federal review. Federal review meant subpoena power. Subpoena power meant Joseph would not be able to smooth this over with corporate language. That evening, Joseph arrived home visibly tense. "They're reviewing our project metrics," he said before I could ask. "Who is?" "The City Oversight Board. It's routine." He said the word routine like an incantation. "Are they looking at specific phases?" I asked. He studied me. "Why do you care?" "I care about public funds." His jaw tightened. "You care about stories. And you care about appearances." The air between us felt heavier than it had in years. "You think I'm corrupt?" he asked finally. I didn't answer immediately. "I think numbers don't change themselves." He stared at me, something sharp flickering in his expression. Not guilt. Not yet. Fear. "You have no idea how complex these deals are," he said. "Then explain them." He didn't. Instead, he reached for his phone and stepped outside to take a call. Through the window, I watched his silhouette pacing under the streetlight. His free hand moved in quick, agitated gestures. When he came back inside, his composure had been rebuilt. "We're having a strategy dinner next week," he said. "New investment group. It's important." "At Ashford and Vale?" I asked lightly. He hesitated. "Yes. Full circle. I'd like you to come," he added. "It'll show unity." Unity. He needed optics. I nodded. Of course. The next morning, I submitted the preliminary report through a protected federal disclosure portal. I did not sign my name as the reporting journalist. I signed as a concerned citizen with documented evidence of potential misuse of public redevelopment funds. The confirmation receipt appeared on my screen within minutes. There was no dramatic soundtrack. No thunderclap. Just a timestamp. I leaned back in my chair and felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Not revenge. I had fantasized, briefly, about humiliating him the way he had humiliated me, about exposing Lauren publicly, about reclaiming dignity in spectacle. But spectacle fades. Records remain. Later that afternoon, Logan called me directly. "Megan," he said smoothly, "I hear you've been asking questions." I always ask questions. "You're close to this situation. Proximity doesn't change math." There was a pause. "You understand how damaging unverified accusations can be," he continued. "I don't deal in accusations," I replied. "Only documentation." Another pause. "If there are concerns," he said carefully, "they can be addressed internally. Internal review. Controlled containment. No system audits itself, honestly, when incentives are misaligned," I said. His tone cooled. "Be careful." "About what?" "About collateral damage." When the call ended, I stared at the dark screen of my phone. Collateral damage. Joseph believed I was reacting to humiliation. Logan believed I was threatening corporate stability. Neither understood that I had already moved beyond both. That night, Joseph returned later than usual. He looked exhausted. "They're freezing discretionary bonuses until the review is complete," he said flatly. "That seems prudent." He studied my face, searching for something, sympathy, perhaps, or allegiance. "You don't seem surprised," he said. I read the filings. Silence stretched between us. "Did you report something?" he asked quietly. The question was casual in tone, but loaded in weight. "I report patterns," I said. He stepped closer. "Megan." I met his eyes. "If there's nothing wrong," I said softly, "there's nothing to fear." He exhaled slowly, and for the first time, I saw the mask slip. Not confession. Not yet. But calculation. He was running scenarios in his head. Damage control. Containment. Blame allocation. And in that moment, I realized something else. The slap at the restaurant had been Lauren's impulse. Joseph's silence had been habit. But this quiet unraveling, was consequence. 2 days later, I received confirmation from Daniel. Regulatory review had been initiated at a preliminary level. No names publicly attached. Yet, Joseph stood in the living room that evening, scrolling through his phone, unaware that the thread holding his professional narrative together had already begun to fray. He thought the worst thing he faced was a board inquiry. He had no idea that federal oversight had just entered the room. And this time, I wouldn't ask him to explain. I would let the records do it for him. The first official notice arrived on a Monday morning. Joseph was halfway through his coffee when his phone buzzed with a calendar alert he hadn't scheduled. I watched the color drain from his face as he read the email twice. "What is it?" I asked calmly. "Compliance review," he said. "They're doing a formal audit of Phase 3. Is that unusual?" "No." The word came too fast. "It's standard." But his hand trembled slightly as he set the phone down. By noon, he had taken 3 private calls on the balcony. His voice was lower than usual, sharper. I caught fragments through the cracked door. "Who flagged it?" "No. We adjusted before quarter close." Logan said this was contained. Contained? That word again. When he stepped back inside, he tried to reassemble composure. "The board wants clarification on some budget reallocations." "Then clarify them," I said. He stared at me, searching for something in my expression. Guilt. Panic. Alliance. I gave him none. That afternoon, Daniel called. "They've opened a preliminary inquiry," he said without preamble. "Not full investigation yet, but federal oversight has been notified due to cross-state transfers." My pulse remained steady. "How long before it escalates?" "That depends on internal cooperation." Internal cooperation. I thought of Logan's measured tone, of his warning about collateral damage. What happens if someone starts deleting records? I asked. "Then it becomes obstruction," Daniel replied. Obstruction carried weight. Criminal weight. That evening, Joseph's agitation intensified. He paced between the kitchen and living room. Phone pressed to his ear. "I told you to move it after review." "Not before," he hissed at one point. I stepped into the hallway deliberately. He stopped mid-sentence and lowered his voice. "I'll call you back." Everything okay? I asked. He forced a tight smile. Just contractors overreacting. Overreacting to what? Rumors. About audits. His jaw flexed. Megan. Not every conversation needs your analysis. I nodded slowly. Of course. Later that night, after he fell asleep, I walked past his office again. The laptop was open. An email draft sat unsent. Subject line: Document Retention Policy Update. The body requested immediate review and archiving of non-essential communication related to subcontractor negotiations. Archiving. I took a picture with my phone. Quietly. Carefully. I did not touch the laptop. The next morning, headlines began shifting tone. City launches, formal review of redevelopment cost escalations. Joseph's company name appeared halfway down the article. He read it at the breakfast table. Jaw clenched. They're making it sound bigger than it is, he muttered. Is it? I asked. He looked up sharply. You're enjoying this. The accusation surprised me. I'm observing it, I replied. He stood abruptly, chair scraping against hardwood. Do you know what this could do to my career? The irony pressed against my ribs. Yes, I said softly. I do. He stared at me for a long moment. And I could see it, the suspicion blooming. You talked to someone, he said. I talk to people for a living. About my company. I report on systems. He took a step closer. Did you report something? There it was again. Not outrage at wrongdoing. Outrage at exposure. If there's nothing wrong, I repeated evenly, you shouldn't be worried. His composure fractured then. You don't understand how this works, he snapped. Sometimes numbers shift to keep projects alive. That's not fraud. That's strategy. Strategy with public funds. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. You think it's black and white? It's not. Ethics usually are. For a second, silence settled thick between us. Then his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen and went pale. What? I asked. Logan's been called in for questioning. Questioning. Not routine. Not casual. Questioning. Joseph sank into the chair. They're widening this, he whispered. I watched him carefully. There was no mention of innocence. No indignation at false allegations. Only fear of scale. By afternoon, Daniel sent another message. They're requesting internal financial logs and executive approvals. This is moving faster than expected. Faster. Because someone inside was cooperating. That evening, Joseph barely spoke. He scrolled through financial dashboards repeatedly, as if staring at numbers could rewrite them. At one point, he looked up at me and said quietly, if this spirals, it won't just be me. A warning. Or a plea. I'm not spiraling anything, I replied. I didn't create the numbers. He leaned back in his chair, exhausted. You've always cared more about being right than being loyal, he said. The words landed heavier than the slap had. Loyal to what? I asked. To you. Or to the truth. He didn't answer. That night, I received confirmation that federal regulators had formally requested documentation under compliance authority. Not a raid. Not yet. But a step that could not be undone. Joseph stood at the window, staring out at the skyline. They're overreacting, he muttered. I stood beside him. The city lights flickered below us. Indifferent. You always said journalism tears things down, I said quietly. He didn't look at me. This isn't journalism, he replied. No, I agreed. It's accountability. For the first time since the restaurant, I saw genuine panic take root in his eyes. Not fear of me. Fear of losing control. And control, once questioned publicly, rarely returns intact. I sent the full evidence packet at 7:23 in the morning. The sun hadn't fully cleared the buildings across the river yet. The city felt suspended in that quiet space before traffic and headlines. My laptop screen glowed against the dim light of the apartment. The encrypted submission portal open. The attachments triple-checked. Internal memos. Budget revisions. The anonymous strategy document. Screenshots of Joseph's document retention email draft. Cross-state wire transfers tied to subcontractors incorporated weeks before approval. I hovered over the final confirmation button for exactly 3 seconds. Then I clicked. A timestamp appeared. Submission received. There was no applause. No dramatic swell of music. Just the low hum of the refrigerator and my own steady breathing. This wasn't revenge. It was escalation. Joseph didn't know yet. He walked into the kitchen 15 minutes later. Tie draped over his shoulder. Scrolling through his phone. Board's calling an emergency meeting. He muttered. Apparently regulators want clarification on transfer structures. Clarification is healthy, I said lightly. He glanced at me, eyes narrowing slightly. You're very calm. I've had practice. He left without finishing his coffee. By noon, his company's internal memo leaked to business media. Senior management cooperating fully with federal oversight regarding redevelopment accounting practices. Federal oversight. They weren't using the word audit anymore. I received a secure message from Daniel at 1:13 p.m. Mem. They've acknowledged receipt. This will likely trigger formal inquiry within days. Days. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. 6 months of observation. 3 weeks of quiet preparation since the slap. Now the machinery had begun to move. That evening, Joseph came home with forced optimism. I've got a preliminary offer, he announced. A separate development firm. They're interested in bringing me on once this noise settles. Noise. You're planning to transition? I asked. Strategic move, he replied. Sometimes it's smarter to pivot before things get messy. He walked toward the bedroom, already rehearsing his narrative. Later that night, he came back into the living room. They want to meet next week, he said. Ashford and Vale again. The same restaurant. The same private dining room. Optics mattered to him. Come with me, he added. It shows stability. Unity. He needed to look untouchable. I met his gaze. Of course. The next morning, I notified Daniel of the dinner. If federal escalation moves quickly, I wrote, he'll likely be in a public setting with investors. His reply was concise. Understood. No elaboration. No promises. Just acknowledgement. By Thursday, media language had sharpened. Potential securities violations under review. Regulators examining wire transfers tied to redevelopment funds. Joseph's name appeared in paragraph 4. He stopped eating dinner halfway through and pushed his plate aside. They're fishing, he said. They don't have anything. If they didn't, I replied quietly, they wouldn't be asking. He looked at me sharply. You think this is funny? I think this is predictable. He stood abruptly. You've been distant since that night, he said. Since the restaurant? I held his gaze. You were distant first. He exhaled, frustration flashing across his face. This isn't about Lauren, he snapped. This is about my career. Exactly. Saturday evening arrived cool and clear. Ashford and Vale glowed under warm exterior lighting. Valet attendants moving efficiently. Suited guests stepping in and out of black sedans. I wore a simple black dress again. Not dramatic. Not defensive. Joseph adjusted his cufflinks in the reflection of the restaurant's glass doors. Tonight is important, he said. Let's keep things smooth. Smooth? We entered the private dining room. 2 representatives from the new firm sat already reviewing printed projections. Logan was there too, composed, watching everything with careful detachment. Joseph launched into presentation mode effortlessly. Revenue forecasts. Projected expansion. Streamlined cost structures. He spoke confidently about resilience and long-term growth. His phone vibrated twice against the table. He ignored it. Midway through the second course, I felt my own phone buzz discreetly in my clutch. A single message from Daniel. They're in position. I didn't react. Joseph raised his glass. To new beginnings, he said again, echoing his toast from weeks earlier. Crystal chimed softly. Then the door opened. 2 individuals stepped inside. Professional, measured. One female, One male. Dark suits. Federal insignia clipped subtly at their waists. The room quieted instantly. Joseph Whitaker? The woman asked calmly. Joseph's smile faltered. Yes? We need to speak with you regarding a federal inquiry into securities and wire transfer violations tied to redevelopment contracts. The words settled into the room like weight. Investors exchanged glances. One of them slowly closed his folder. Joseph let out a short laugh. There must be some mistake. This is not voluntary, the agent said evenly. We have formal documentation. He glanced at Logan. Logan did not move. Did not defend. Did not intervene. Joseph's color drained visibly. In that same room, weeks earlier, I had stood with a burning cheek while he told me not to make it worse. Now every eye in the private dining room turned toward him. Not with pity, with calculation. Can we do this privately? Joseph asked. We can step outside, the agent replied. But we will need your cooperation immediately. His hand trembled slightly as he set down his glass. For a split second, he looked at me. Confusion. Suspicion. Something dawning. I didn't look away. This time, I wasn't the one standing alone. This time, the room was watching him. And for the first time since the slap, Joseph understood that silence would not protect him anymore. The room went completely silent. Even the soft jazz that had been playing through the hidden speakers seemed to dissolve into the background. The two federal agents stepped fully inside the private dining room, closing the door behind them with quiet finality. Joseph Whitaker, the female agent repeated, her tone professional. Controlled, Joseph cleared his throat. Yes, I'm Joseph. She presented a folder. You are being formally notified of an active federal investigation involving securities fraud, wire transfers, and potential misrepresentation of public redevelopment funds. We need you to accompany us for questioning. One of the investment representatives leaned back slowly in his chair. Logan remained seated, hands folded, expression unreadable. Joseph forced a strained smile. This must be a misunderstanding. We're cooperating fully. This is not a voluntary request, the agent replied evenly. You have been named in documentation connected to financial irregularities. Documentation. The word landed hard. Joseph's eyes flicked briefly toward me. I didn't move. The male agent continued. There are concerns regarding offshore transfers tied to subcontractor adjustments and executive bonus thresholds. A whisper slipped across the table. Offshore, one of the investors murmured. Joseph's composure cracked at the edges. That's not accurate, he said quickly. We operate within compliance parameters. You'll have the opportunity to clarify, the agent replied. But we need to proceed now. Logan finally stood. I've been cooperating with regulators, he said calmly. Full transparency. Joseph turned toward him sharply. You said this was contained? Logan's expression hardened slightly. It was until new information surfaced. New information. I kept my breathing slow. Joseph's gaze shifted back to the agents. This is overreach, he insisted. There are complex financial structures involved. We're aware of the structures. The male agent interrupted. We're specifically interested in your authorization signatures. Authorization signatures. The investor across from Joseph slowly pushed his plate aside. Lauren was not there. She had not attended this dinner. She had distanced herself the moment rumors intensified. But her absence felt loud. One of the agents flipped open the folder and turned it slightly so Joseph could see. I recognized the format immediately. Time-stamped digital approvals. Transfer confirmations. Subcontractor invoices. He stared at the page longer than he should have. This doesn't prove intent, he said quietly. It establishes participation, the agent responded. The words rearranged the air in the room. Participation. Not mistake. Not oversight. Participation. Joseph swallowed hard. Can we discuss this privately? He asked again. You may step outside, the agent replied. But we will require your cooperation immediately. He looked at Logan once more. Logan didn't intervene. Didn't object. Didn't offer support. The investors avoided eye contact. Joseph rose slowly from his chair. The same chair he had occupied weeks earlier when Lauren slapped me and he told me not to make it worse. The reversal was not loud. It was precise. As he stepped toward the door, he hesitated and turned toward me. "You did this," he whispered. His voice was low enough that only I could hear it. "No," I said calmly. "You signed it." His eyes widened slightly. For the first time, certainty entered them. "You knew," he breathed. "I knew enough." The agents waited patiently. "Sir," the female agent said gently, "we need to proceed." He stepped outside with them. The door closed. Silence flooded the room. One of the investors exhaled sharply. "Logan." "How exposed are we?" Logan's voice remained measured. "That depends on how quickly we address compliance failures." Compliance failures. Language always softens impact. I stood slowly. "Excuse me," I said. No one stopped me. In the hallway outside the private room, Joseph stood between the two agents. Not handcuffed. Not yet. But contained. He looked smaller. Not physically? Structurally? "Is this about the audit?" he asked the agents, trying to regain control of the narrative. "It's about more than the audit," the male agent replied. Joseph's eyes found mine again. "Was any of it real?" he asked quietly. "Our marriage." The question struck unexpectedly. "It was real," I answered. "Until you decided appearances mattered more than integrity." He flinched. "You could have come to me," he said. "I did," I replied. "You told me not to make it worse." The agents exchanged a glance. "We'll need to take you in for formal questioning," the female agent said. "You are not under arrest at this time. But you are required to comply." "Not under arrest." "Yet," Joseph inhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. "I need to call my attorney," he said. "You may do so." He looked at me one final time. There was no anger in his expression now. Only fear. Not of me. Of consequence. The agents guided him toward the exit. The restaurant lobby was quieter than usual. A few guests looked up curiously as they passed. No one clapped. No one gasped. They simply watched. I remained standing in the hallway until the glass doors closed behind them. My cheek no longer hurt. The humiliation from weeks earlier felt distant. What remained was clarity. Back inside the private dining room, the investors were already discussing damage control strategies, containment, public statements, legal teams. Logan caught my eye briefly. "You understand this isn't finished," he said quietly. "I never assumed it was," I replied. "Because investigations don't end with escorts. They expand." Joseph had believed the worst moment of his month was a public embarrassment at dinner. He had believed the greatest threat to his stability was his wife asking questions. He hadn't understood that the real shift happened the moment evidence left my hands and entered federal channels. The slap had been loud, but the paperwork was louder. And tonight, the room that once watched me stand alone had witnessed something far more permanent. Not revenge. Exposure. The headlines broke before sunrise. Senior Project Manager questioned in Federal Redevelopment Probe. By 8 a.m., Joseph's name was trending across local business feeds. By 9, national outlets had picked up the story. Words like securities violations and wire fraud appeared in bold type, stacked above glossy photos of high-rise renderings and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. I sat at the kitchen table, coffee untouched, reading every update with the same detached focus I brought to any investigation. The article cited anonymous sources within regulatory agencies. It referenced offshore transfers tied to subcontractor adjustments. It mentioned executive bonus structures connected to budget escalations. It did not mention me. Yet, my editor called at 9:12. "Are you safe?" she asked first. "Yes." "Are you involved?" "I'm aware." A pause. "Do we have documentation?" she asked. "Yes." "Is it clean?" "Every number." She exhaled slowly. "Then we move carefully." "Move carefully." Care had already shaped every decision. By noon, Joseph had been released pending further review. Not arrested. Not charged. But named. His attorney left a voicemail requesting immediate clarification regarding any communication I had with regulators. I let Daniel respond. No marital privilege had been breached. No confidential spousal conversations disclosed. All documentation sourced independently through public filings and anonymous submission. Facts. Joseph called late afternoon. You spoke to them, he said. Voice tight. I spoke to numbers. You went outside the marriage. You stepped outside it first. He inhaled sharply. You don't understand how this looks. I understand exactly how it looks. Silence stretched between us. They're freezing discretionary accounts, he said finally. They're subpoenaing internal emails. Subpoena. The word carried weight. That's standard procedure, I replied. You wanted this, he said. I wanted transparency. He let out a bitter laugh. You chose your career over your husband. I stared at the skyline beyond the window. You chose fraud over integrity. He hung up. By evening, social media had turned volatile. Commentary threads debated corporate corruption in urban redevelopment. Analysts dissected executive compensation models. Civic groups demanded expanded oversight. My prior reporting on municipal cost inflation resurfaced and circulated again. Industry insiders began whispering about a broader pattern. Lauren issued a short public statement through her nonprofit's website. I was unaware of any financial irregularities and am fully cooperating with any review. Her employer placed her on administrative leave by the end of the day. The nonprofit's donation page was quietly taken offline. Damage spreads quickly when tied to documentation. Joseph's parents called that night. His mother's voice trembled. Why didn't you protect him? She asked. Protect him from what? I replied gently. From this? From consequences. A long silence followed. His father spoke only once. Is it true? Yes. The line disconnected shortly after. I returned to my laptop and finalized the exposé I had been drafting for months. Not emotional. Not vindictive. Structured. It traced the architecture of cost manipulation. How revised projections aligned with executive incentives. How subcontractor incorporation dates clustered suspiciously before budget amendments. How public redevelopment funds moved through layered entities before stabilizing on balance sheets. Joseph's name appeared in context. As a signatory. As an authorizer. As a participant. The article went live at 6:45 the next morning. By 7, it was being shared nationally. Stock in the parent firm dropped sharply by midday. The board issued an emergency statement announcing internal restructuring and full cooperation with federal regulators. Logan publicly distanced himself from operational misjudgments. Operational misjudgments. Language always tries to soften impact. Joseph called again that evening. They're making me the scapegoat, he said hoarsely. Did you sign the approvals? Yes. But did you benefit from the bonus triggers? A pause. Yes. Then you're not the scapegoat. His breathing grew uneven. They're reviewing offshore transfers, he said. They're expanding the scope. Scope. The investigation was widening. It no longer centered on one phase. It centered on structure. I never meant for it to go this far, he whispered. Intent is rarely the defense people think it is. You should have thought about that before you told me not to make it worse, I said quietly. Silence again. You destroyed everything, he said finally. I looked around the apartment. The furniture still in place. The walls intact. The skyline unchanged. No, I replied. You built it this way. 2 days later, the board announced Joseph's suspension pending formal charges. The new firm withdrew its preliminary offer. Lauren's nonprofit dissolved under scrutiny. Federal prosecutors confirmed a grand jury was reviewing evidence tied to redevelopment cost inflation. Grand jury. The words felt heavier than any headline so far. I filed for divorce that afternoon. No spectacle. No confrontation. Just paperwork. When I signed the documents, my hand did not shake. The marriage had ended long before federal oversight entered the room. It ended the night I stood under crystal light with a burning cheek and watched my husband choose silence over me. Everything after that was simply consequence unfolding on a larger stage. By the time the sun set that evening, Joseph's empire of projections and inflated margins had begun to collapse in earnest. And for the first time in months, I felt something close to stillness. Not triumph. Not sorrow. Clarity. The indictment was announced on a gray Tuesday morning. By 10 a.m., federal prosecutors had formally charged Joseph with conspiracy to commit securities fraud, wire fraud tied to cross-state transfers, and misrepresentation of public redevelopment funds. His name appeared alongside 2 other senior executives in a 26-page document detailing cost inflation strategies and concealed bonus triggers. I read every page, not as his wife, as someone who understood how carefully language is constructed when consequences are permanent. The document referenced internal emails, digital authorization logs, wire transfers routed through layered entities, subcontractor agreements approved days before quarterly review thresholds. It was precise. There was no room left for ambiguity. Joseph was arraigned that afternoon. I attended. Not to support him. Not to confront him. To witness. The federal courthouse felt colder than I expected. Fluorescent lighting flattened every expression. The air carried that faint metallic scent of polished floors and institutional coffee. Joseph entered in a navy suit that once fit him confidently. Now it hung differently. He did not look at me as he took his seat at the defense table. The prosecutor outlined the structure methodically. Over a period of 18 months, she said, the defendants knowingly authorized inflated redevelopment budgets designed to trigger executive performance compensation. Slides projected onto a screen behind her displayed spreadsheets, timestamps, transaction IDs, intent, participation, personal financial gain. The defense attempted to reframe the narrative. Corporate complexity, Joseph's attorney argued. Layered approval structures. Shared responsibility among executive leadership. He positioned Joseph as operational, not strategic. A man following directives, not designing them. The prosecutor responded by highlighting Joseph's digital sign-offs. Each approval tied directly to revised budget thresholds. Each threshold aligned with bonus triggers. The courtroom remained quiet. No dramatic gasps, just the steady rhythm of evidence. Logan testified the following day. He admitted to oversight failures, to trusting internal projections too readily, to not questioning certain subcontractor relationships aggressively enough. But when asked directly whether Joseph had approved the revised budgets knowingly, Logan's answer was clear. Yes. No hesitation. No protection. I watched Joseph's shoulders stiffen at the defense table. The fracture between them was now public record. During a recess, Joseph's attorney approached me in the hallway. Your reporting contributed to public perception, he said carefully. My reporting contributed to transparency, I replied. He held my gaze for a moment, then nodded slightly. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution introduced evidence of a private bonus transfer, an offshore routing detail. The defense objected. The judge overruled. Joseph was asked directly whether he authorized the transaction. He hesitated. A long enough hesitation. Yes, he said finally. The words settled into the courtroom like finality. There was no dramatic collapse. No shouting. Just recognition. Closing arguments were brief. The prosecution emphasized pattern and intent. The defense emphasized complexity and corporate culture. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. When they returned, the courtroom felt tighter. Joseph stared straight ahead. The foreperson stood. On the count of conspiracy to commit securities fraud, we find the defendant guilty. The word echoed in a way the slap never had. On the count of wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty. My breathing remained steady. On the count of misrepresentation of public redevelopment funds, we find the defendant guilty. Joseph closed his eyes briefly. No outburst. No plea. Just acceptance. Sentencing followed weeks later. The judge spoke calmly. Abuse of public trust carries consequences beyond financial loss. Public redevelopment funds are intended to serve communities, not executive compensation structures. Prison term. Financial restitution. Permanent industry ban. The gavel struck once. Joseph did not look at me until he was being escorted away. Outside the courthouse. He asked to speak with me briefly. The agents allowed a moment. "Was this justice to you?" he asked quietly. "This wasn't about me," I replied. "You could have protected me." I held his gaze. "You could have protected yourself." He nodded once. A small, resigned motion. "I didn't think it would matter," he said. "It always matters." There was nothing left to argue. The legal process had done what arguments inside a marriage never could. It had recorded everything. In the weeks that followed, systemic reforms began rolling out. Oversight committees expanded. Whistleblower protections strengthened. Compliance audits increased across redevelopment projects. The investigation had widened beyond Joseph. It was no longer a story about a marriage. It was a story about structure. My divorce finalized quietly the same month. No contested assets. Accounts frozen by restitution orders simplified the division. I removed my wedding ring in the courthouse bathroom and placed it in my purse. The weight of it had shifted long before. That night, alone in my apartment, I replayed the moment at Ashford and Vale. The sound of the slap, the way he told me not to make it worse. I understood something clearly now. The humiliation had not destroyed me. It had clarified me. Joseph had once believed journalism only tore things down. He never understood that what collapses under scrutiny was already unstable. And as I stood by my window, watching the city move forward without pause, I realized something else. Silence protects no one. Not in marriage. Not in business. Not in systems built on inflated numbers. Truth does not shout. It documents. And once documented, it does not disappear. The courtroom felt smaller the day the verdict was read. Not physically smaller. Structurally smaller. As if the walls themselves understood that the illusion of control had collapsed. Joseph sat at the defense table with a stillness that looked rehearsed. His suit was pressed, his hair trimmed neatly. But something essential had shifted. The confidence he used to carry into boardrooms had drained into something quieter, more brittle. The prosecutor stood and outlined the final summary once more. Over a sustained period, the defendant authorized financial adjustments that directly benefited him through performance incentives tied to inflated redevelopment budgets. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. The evidence had already done its work. Spreadsheets projected on the courtroom screen showed time-stamped approvals. Transfers routed through layered accounts. Emails discussing timing adjustments before quarterly disclosures. The defense repeated its final argument. Corporate pressure. Complex structures. Shared responsibility. Joseph's attorney emphasized that systemic issues existed above his client's authority. He portrayed Joseph as an ambitious executive caught in a flawed environment. But intent had already been documented. Participation had already been traced. The jury listened quietly. I sat in the gallery, hands folded in my lap, watching not as a wife, not even as a journalist, but as a witness to consequence. When the jury returned, the air tightened. The foreperson stood. On the count of conspiracy to commit securities fraud, we find the defendant guilty. Joseph's jaw flexed once. On the count of wire fraud involving public redevelopment funds, we find the defendant guilty. His shoulders dropped slightly. On the count of misrepresentation of financial reporting tied to municipal oversight, we find the defendant guilty. The word guilty echoed without drama. No one gasped. No one applauded. Justice rarely arrives loudly. The judge spoke next. Public trust is not a negotiable asset, he said. When individuals exploit public funding structures for private gain, the damage extends beyond balance sheets. Prison term. Financial restitution. Permanent ban from holding executive positions tied to public contracts. Joseph nodded faintly as the sentence was delivered. He did not look at me during the reading. He waited until the bailiff stepped closer before turning his head slightly. Our eyes met. There was no anger left in his expression, only exhaustion. Afterward, in the courthouse hallway, he asked to speak with me briefly. The officer allowed a moment. "Was this worth it?" he asked quietly. The question felt different now. Not accusatory. Resigned. This wasn't about worth. I said, "It was about truth." He let out a slow breath. "You could have protected me." The words were softer this time. "You asked me to protect your image," I replied. "Not your integrity." He looked down at his hands. "I thought it would stay contained," he said. Contained. That word again. "You always believed systems bend if you understand them well enough," I said. "You forgot they also record?" He gave a small nod. There was nothing left to argue. No marriage to salvage. No narrative to spin. Just record. In the weeks that followed, the fallout expanded beyond him. Additional executives were charged in related investigations. Oversight committees implemented stricter audit triggers for redevelopment contracts. Federal compliance requirements tightened. The story stopped being about Joseph. It became about systemic reform. Media outlets credited investigative reporting for accelerating scrutiny. My name appeared in industry panels and policy discussions. I accepted invitations selectively. At one forum, a moderator asked, "Did personal involvement make this investigation harder?" I answered honestly. It made it clearer. There was a ripple of quiet understanding in the room. Divorce paperwork finalized the same month sentencing concluded. No dramatic courtroom exchange. No contested assets. Federal restitution orders had frozen most accounts. Simplifying division. When I signed the last document, I felt something close. Not heartbreak. Closure. The wedding ring sat in my drawer at home. I held it once before placing it inside an envelope. It felt lighter than I remembered. Back at my apartment that evening, I stood by the window overlooking the river. The skyline glowed in steady indifference. Traffic moved. Construction cranes remained frozen against the horizon. Life did not pause for verdicts. I thought back to the restaurant, to the chandelier light, to Lauren's hand striking my cheek, to Joseph telling me not to make it worse. That moment had felt like humiliation. Now it felt like ignition. He once told me journalism only tore things down. He never understood that what collapses under scrutiny was already fractured. The verdict did not feel like revenge. It felt like documentation reaching its conclusion. Silence had not protected him. Silence had not protected our marriage. Silence had only delayed exposure. And when truth finally surfaced in a courtroom under fluorescent lights, it carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. I watched the city for a long time that night. Not as a woman who had won. Not as someone who had destroyed. But as someone who had refused to look away, and in refusing, had changed the trajectory of more than just her own life. 3 months after the sentencing, the city had already moved on. Headlines faded. News cycles rotated. The skyline remained the same. Glass towers catching late afternoon light as if nothing had ever been questioned beneath them. But I had changed. My apartment overlooked the river now. Smaller than the house Joseph and I once shared. But quieter. Cleaner. No half-finished conversations lingering in hallways. No phone screens turned face down on kitchen counters. My name stood alone on the lease. My mornings belonged entirely to me. I built a new routine slowly. Coffee by the window. Notes organized across my dining table. Research files for new investigations that had nothing to do with redevelopment contracts or offshore transfers. Yet the impact of that case lingered everywhere. Federal oversight reforms were implemented across multiple redevelopment boards. Compliance triggers were tightened. Executive compensation structures were re-examined in public-private partnerships. What had begun as a fracture inside my marriage had expanded into structural reform. I received an invitation to accept a National Investigative Journalism Award 2 weeks later. When I stepped onto the stage, applause filled the auditorium. Flashbulbs popped softly. The presenter cited courage in exposing systemic corruption. I didn't mention Joseph in my speech. I didn't mention the slap. I spoke about documentation, about accountability, about how transparency isn't destruction, it's stabilization. When someone underestimates you, I said, my voice steady under the lights, they often reveal more than they intend to. The applause felt distant. Not because it didn't matter, but because it wasn't the point. The point had always been truth. A week later, I returned to Ashford and Vale alone. Not for revenge. Not to relive anything. For closure. The same chandelier shimmered above the private dining room. The same polished marble reflected soft light. The table where everything shifted sat unoccupied. I stood there for a moment, remembering the sound of my cheek being struck. The silence that followed. Joseph's quiet instruction not to make it worse. That had been the fracture line. Not the investigation. Not the arrest. That moment, I realized something standing there that I hadn't fully articulated before. The slap didn't destroy my dignity. His silence revealed where it already stood. I left the restaurant without bitterness. Some stories don't need confrontation at the end. They need perspective. Lauren relocated quietly after her non-profit dissolved under scrutiny. Logan accepted a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation. Joseph began serving his term without appeal. Their chapters closed in different ways. Mine opened. One evening, I wrote a letter I never intended to send. I wrote that I had loved him once, that I believed in him, that I would have defended him fiercely if he had chosen integrity over image. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Closure doesn't always require an audience. It requires release. The last of the legal paperwork finalized shortly after. My divorce certificate arrived in a plain white envelope. I placed it beside the wedding ring I had already sealed away. I didn't feel victorious. I felt lighter. Sometimes the most powerful shift isn't loud. It's the quiet decision to stop protecting someone else's deception. I often think back to that moment under crystal light, when one woman struck me and the man I married chose not to stand beside me. He believed humiliation would keep me small. He believed silence would protect him. He was wrong about both. Revenge would have been shouting in that room. Throwing a glass. Making a scene. Justice was gathering evidence and letting systems respond. There's a difference. If you've ever been told to stay quiet to preserve someone else's reputation, if you've ever stood in a room where everyone watched you and decided you were the inconvenience, if you've ever questioned whether speaking up would cost you everything, know this? Silence does not shield you. It only delays truth. And truth, once documented, carries its own momentum. I don't know what you would have done in my place. Would you have walked away quietly? Would you have confronted him publicly? Would you have ignored the numbers and tried to preserve the marriage? I'd genuinely like to know. If this story resonated with you, if you believe accountability matters more than image, share your thoughts. I read every comment. And if you want more stories about hidden power, family betrayal, and the quiet ways justice unfolds, stay with me. Subscribe. There's more coming. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't shouting in the moment. It's letting the truth speak when the world is finally listening. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.